Okay. Go back to the PowerPoint. So air and air mass, right? Air masses make sense to me. Okay, so it's kind of like clouds. When we said clouds, you talk about kind of their flat or fluffy, their appearance, and their elevation. So for air masses, we talk about what is their temperature and what is their moisture content. So we have a couple of extremes here. This is actually a warm, moist air mass. And we're going to come up with, I think, 5 air mass types. And so it's warm, so we use the word tropical. It's got moisture, so we use the word maritime. Okay? It's maritime tropical air mass. This is the other extreme. It's the extreme with regard to temperature, so instead of maritime, instead of temperature, instead of tropical, it's actually what we call polar. What's polar? It's cold. And instead of being moist, it's dry. So in that case, the temperature part goes with polar. The moisture part goes with, use continental because it's dry. So, air masses. So to me, and like I said, this is Chapter 8 and Chapter 9, we actually look at the idea of a front, but you have a chunk of air here, you know, a chunk of air over here, okay, and where they meet, okay, that is the weather front. Well, I guess they're probably more like flat. So we have A, B, and where they meet, that is the weather front. That's probably better. So how do you get an air mass? How do you get a chunk of air that's cold, or a chunk of air that's warm, or a chunk of air that's dry, or a chunk of air that's moist? Basically, it has to sit over something called a source region. The word source here in source region just means the source of creating that air mass as the right temperature and the right moisture content. I think I've heard kind of this, that it has to sit there a couple weeks. Okay, so right away there are some places on Earth that would not make good source regions. For instance, and I think this is probably why we don't have a good source region here, is because we're too busy. We can't sit for 2 weeks. You can sit for 2 weeks kind of in here, or you can sit for 2 weeks here, okay, and those make good source regions. You can sit for a couple weeks here, but this is a really busy spot. So we have source regions I'm going to show you. So an air mass is a chunk of air that is got the kind of relatively uniform temperature and moisture content by layer. So it's not to say that if you go up that it does get a little bit colder usually, okay, or its moisture changes, it gets drier, but here it's got uniform conditions. So an air mass can either be stable or unstable, and we'll kind of pick out of our 5 air masses, some of them are more stable, some of them are unstable. They can also have within them a strong temperature gradient as you go up. If you want to, let's see, I don't know if this works, because I don't think in my notes I say this, but stable air, you're talking cold and or dry. That's going to give your stable air masses. Unstable, generally warm and or moist. The warm makes sense, and the moist may make sense too. Okay. So the 5 of them are going to be classified according to their temperature and their moisture. Now, just like the example we started out with, we have actually, I guess, a third choice. We have 3 choices with regard to temperature. Remember the example we looked at was maritime tropical. You can be tropical, which is warm. You can be polar, which is cold. You can be very cold, which is Arctic. Okay, so 3 choices. It's kind of mix and match of temperatures. Now, you're also going to want to know the letter that goes along with them. So capital T for tropical, capital P for polar, Arctic is even colder, capital A. So we need to mix those temperatures with moisture. So the moisture goes like this. And it's the examples that we looked at again earlier. If it's dry, it's continental. If it's moist, it's maritime. Okay, so So we're going to mix and match those three temperatures with these moisture conditions. Notice that these are a lowercase c for continental or dry, a lowercase m for moisture, or for maritime or moist. All right. So here we go. There they are. There's all 5 of them. We have continental, tropical, and sometimes these are the sort of things, little scientific terms that you chant. Continental, tropical, continental, dry, tropical meaning warm. So you just kind of, continental polar meaning dry, cold, maritime tropical meaning moist, warm, maritime polar meaning moist, cold, and we only have one Arctic. The problem with very cold air is that it does not hold much water vapor. So continental Arctic is all we got. All right, that's it. So like the surface map we looked at just a little bit ago before we started on lecture, those fronts, those cold fronts, okay, or the warm fronts, they are actually the marking between 2 air masses. Okay. So sometimes you'll look at different weather maps and they'll draw their lines differently. Sometimes it's easier to tell where one air mass ends and one new air mass begins. Not always easy. So this is a handy little table. We have continental Arctic, CP. But notice that for the C is always lowercase for continental. So continental Arctic, lowercase c, uppercase A. Continental polar, lowercase c, uppercase P. Continental tropical, lowercase c, uppercase T. Maritime tropical, lowercase m, uppercase T. And maritime polar, lowercase m, uppercase P. There they are. All 5 of them. So I have 2 slides here, 2 figures from your textbook that show the wintertime source regions and then the summertime source regions. So let's see what we got. So kind of starting up there, does it make sense if I start up here, kind of over land? At the very north, it's going to be continental Arctic. If I go a little bit into Canada, that source region would be a little bit warmer, so it'd be continental polar. We have kind of on the sides there, we have, those should be maritime, right? The Pacific, the Atlantic. They're maritime and they're polar because they're cold. Then we kind of have our toasty ones down here. Notice actually all of that is coming from wet source regions, so it's got to be maritime, and it's warm, so it's maritime tropical. Okay. So sometimes I put on my tests this question, and you're going to see it kind of in the slides, but if the winter, okay, only in the winter do you have conditions to give you the Arctic, continental Arctic, only in the winter. So this is kind of fun, so be kind of listening if you haven't already to like the newscasters, because sometimes they'll say, you know, we're under the influence of a continental polar air mass, and you're like, continental dry, polar cold. Okay. And it's kind of neat, a lot of the weather phenomenon, like the nor'easters, I know people are kind of excited about, you know, that happen in our northeast. Those are generated by air masses. So air masses are our player in weather patterns. Okay, so that's the winter. This is the summer. Okay, I already told you in the summer, our continental Arctic went away. So we only have continental polar, but we still have our 2 source regions for moist, cold. So these are maritime polar on the Pacific and the Atlantic. Then we have our source regions down here for warm, moist air, so it's maritime tropical. We picked up a source region. Only in the summertime do you get continental tropical air masses coming from this source region. Okay, only in the summertime do you get these guys right here. And so if we think, what is continental tropical? Like I said, sometimes I'll just mold terms over in my mind. Continental must mean dry, tropical must mean warm. So that's why we're kind of talking over land in kind of our southwest. And actually, continental tropical air masses that kind of move up, they can be players to bring severe weather. Cool. So, like you might imagine, once a chunk of air has picked up, they say it's almost like picking up an accent. Once a chunk of air has dwelt over a source region for a couple of weeks and become warm or cold or dry or moist, and then moves on. Okay, it keeps those characteristics for a while, but you would imagine eventually there's an exchange between the air mass and what it's moving over. If it's moving south, it's going to get warmer. If it's moving north, it's going to get cooler. Okay, so they do become modified over time. Okay, and that modification over time is called air mass modification. Like I said, it's not isolated, so it can go ahead and cool off or heat up or dry out or get moisture. Air mass modification. So this idea of a chunk of air becoming modified is actually a player too. I have some examples of air mass modification. So this is showing you how a chunk of air gets warmer. So it starts, okay, I don't know if we'd call this, I don't know how cold it needs to be called Arctic, okay, but that's pretty cold. Continental Arctic air mass. So you can see it started out as minus 51, okay, minus 27, minus 20, minus 9, okay. Although it could be for that time of year, you know, even down here in Houston, 25 is cold. So it becomes modified as it leaves the source region. So anytime the meteorologist says that we're under the influence of just air mass weather, it just means basically an air mass is moved over us, and whatever it is, we've got. Okay, air mass weather. So here's a figure from your textbook, has some kind of helpful things. Let's see if it has anything. I think it's just kind of, it's got those 5 different types of air masses: continental Arctic, continental polar, maritime polar, continental tropical, only in the summertime, maritime tropical. Could be helpful. So continental polar. So continental polar would be just a little bit warmer than continental Arctic, right? Continental polar air masses. So I have a slide kind of that summarizes some of the things I pulled out from your textbook. Remember a few slides ago I said for stable, I said go ahead and put cold and dry. Okay, continental polar, dry and cold. Okay, so these guys are stable. And remember, what stability means is it's not moving up, and if it's not moving up, you're not going to get it to precipitate. So these are generally, you know, clear skies. Okay, so continental polar air masses are stable. They don't rise. But I'm going to show you how continental polar air masses, we can have actually the air mass become modified. You guys have probably always all heard of lake effect snow. Can't remember if this has been a bad year for lake effect snow. I think it has. So lake effect snow actually occurs because of a dry, cold air mass. But the lakes they're talking about are the Great Lakes. And so basically you have a cold, dry air mass moving over the Great Lakes, or a Great Lake, and becoming modified. Because remember, the lakes can retain their heat longer so they can stay nice and toasty. So it becomes modified, and then on the other side of the lake, it dumps. So lake effect snow kind of dumps on the downwind side of the lake. And it looks like this. So over here, we have our cold, dry air, continental polar air mass. This right here is one of the Great Lakes. So we have a prevailing wind, probably a westerly wind, blowing that continental polar air over warm lake. So nice and toasty, it can go ahead and add water vapor to your dry, cold air mass. Cold air can hold less water vapor, so basically it's going to condense in that under those temperatures. It goes ahead and it picks up sufficient moisture to go ahead and dump its snow on the other side. So lake effect snow, that's kind of how it works. So this is kind of showing you the results of lake effect snow. The darker the blue, the more snow they get. And I hadn't done this recently. Let's see if it'll do this. So this is showing air mass modification 2. Air mass modification, a chunk of air picking up different characteristics. So here we have, and they've kind of have this little inset here where this is like the East Coast. So we have continental polar air mass meeting warm, moist air. And when that cold air goes into that warm, moist air, it goes ahead and picks up moisture, and it has clouds formed. All right. So, kind of wish I hadn't erased this over here, but I said that we were going to kind of come back to the polar front, so we're coming back to the polar front right now. Remember what the polar front is between the feral and the polar cells. Okay, so it's possible to have, where's the Earth that I just kicked? In the wintertime, remember we have a possibility of having continental Arctic air. Oh, I'll go up here. It's possible to have continental Arctic air meeting continental polar air. I know it sounds kind of strange, but they're both dry and they're very cold and cold. And so that creates what we call an Arctic front, and that's shown right here. So if we kind of think of the North Pole is here, so we have very cold, dry air, and then in front of it we have just cold, dry air, continental polar. Okay, so where they meet actually is called the Arctic front, or unarctic front. Okay, and it would just only be in the wintertime. But now I remember what this slide is. But I can kind of compare and contrast that to the polar front. So I've gone ahead, and this figure actually has the polar front too. So remember, the polar front would be between the polar cell and the feral cell. So it runs about 60 degrees latitude, but you know, it wanders around a little bit. So that right there is the polar front. The Arctic front, unarctic front, would be between two cold air masses. One's very cold and one's just pretty cold, which are both dry. And the polar front is between the two cells. The polar front is much deeper than the Arctic front. All right, so maritime polar. Maritime meaning has moisture, polar meaning it's cold. Remember we looked at two source regions, kind of from the Pacific and the Atlantic. Okay, these actually, we'll talk more in Chapter 9 about nor'easters, but this chapter talks a little bit about nor'easters. They come from these cold, moist air masses. Basically, remember we talked about, let's see, it's cyclonic, yep. So hopefully you guys are kind of getting under your belt. Cyclonic means L for low, okay. So here in this region of space, actually we have a central low pressure out here. One of the other things you're kind of getting under your belt for this unit is if you have a low, you should in the northern hemisphere be thinking counterclockwise. Okay, and that's actually what we have going on here. So a cyclone, a central low pressure, can go ahead and bring down cold, moist air. Okay, and that's a nor'easter. Maritime polar. So here's another bit about modification, kind of from left to right. So if it's over here, that would be kind of Asia-ish, I think. It should be continental polar is dry and cold, Okay, so that chunk of air moves. Now notice it's over the Pacific Ocean, and it's becoming modified. It's still continental, but it's a little less stable, picking up some moisture. If it sits long enough over an ocean like that, it's going to become now maritime, not continental. And so we definitely have moisture being picked up. And remember what I said when I said stable and unstable? I put moisture under unstable. So here we have moisture, which makes it unstable, a bit of instability, and polar makes it stable in general. But my point is it's decreasing, increasing instability, decreasing stability. All right. So maritime, tropical, maritime meaning moist, tropical meaning warm. So that's where there's actually a couple, a third source region if you want. I think in the summertime we say. So the source regions for maritime tropical are here in the Pacific, here in the Atlantic, and the Gulf can actually be a source region for maritime tropical air. So this actually is a situation where it's moist, it's unstable, it's warm, it's unstable. So maritime tropical, to me, are the most unstable, unpredictable air masses there are. Yep. Ripe for precipitation, maritime tropical. So this is kind of showing you a warm, moist air mass that's lifting, has some sort of lifting mechanism going on. And when it lifts up, it cools down, and it can cool down to the point of condensation. All right. I think we'll probably finish this chapter. Air mass modification. Actually, that's not air mass modification. Maritime tropical air mass is unstable. Maritime tropical source regions, to me, I think we actually kind of have a couple of source regions over here. We have the Gulf, and we also have the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so here, these folks get a fair bit of precipitation just probably due to those two source regions. So kind of a little bit related to the nor'easter, because we'll call them both extratropical cyclones in the next chapter, is something called the Pineapple Express. I think we will anyway. The Pineapple Express is related to basically warm, moist air hitching a ride on the jet stream. So, and they call it the Pineapple Express because it passes Hawaii. Let's see. I think we're fine with that. Okay. So another situation where air masses are a big player in weather is where warm, moist air masses, and actually we talked about this monsoons. That's right. We talked. This is only a little bit. Remember, we talked actually tonight about monsoons, the seasonal situation where we actually create a low. We have a low pressure here, and because it's low, we have incoming air, and some of that incoming air is moist and warm. So that's kind of what that's showing you there. Cool. That's like deja vu. And then the last slide is something we're actually going to refer to when we talk about severe weather. Remember, continental tropical air masses, in case you run into it on a test, only form in the summertime. Continental tropical means that they're warm and dry, And I mentioned that we'll be talking about them again. We talk about severe weather because as continental tropical air masses bump up against maritime air masses, actually they create what's called a dry line. And storm chasers like to chase them and look for tornadoes. So let's go ahead